Hi there. Really glad that you're joining us tonight or in the recording on this. We've had some technical difficulties, but we're going to go at this because we think it's important enough to really have this conversation. This is right after the vice presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Vice President Pence. And we are now with a panel of three great, amazing people. My name is Susan Schultz. I'm executive director of the Museum of Broadcast Communication. We are doing this series of live streams after the presidential and vice presidential debates, really to augment the curriculum that we put together on greatdebates.org, greatdebates.org, greatdebates.org. It's for lifelong learners, it's for educators, teachers, parents who want to have a little help in how they talk about this election cycle, this presidential cycle with their students, whether they're middle schoolers or high schoolers. You'll find 8 pieces of curriculum there, as well as a timeline of 100 years. And again, 9 articles that really talk about how, as the media evolved, it disrupted the presidential campaigns. Every 4 years, there was a different way, whether it was radio, television, or digital, that people had to communicate. So, and right now, we want to bring on the panel right away. We have three guests here tonight, great academics. Our first is Dennis Cremin up at the top. You are a professor of history at Lewis University. You are also our connection with our co-writer for the curriculum. And you are also you're the chair of the history department, aren't you?
I am.
Yes, you are. And the History Center Director and the author of Grand Park, The Evolution of Chicago's Front Yard. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And next we have Deborah Douglas, who is a veteran journalist. She's the Distinguished Visiting Professor at DePauw University, where she teaches journalism. She served as editor-in-chief of the Chicago Sun-Times Red Streak edition, and she's appeared on CNN, BBC, ABC, WGN Radio, and B103. She also is a trainer with the Op-Ed Project, which is a global project giving voice to other voices, and she is the ME for the MLK 50 project. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We also have Carol, Carol Summerfield, who is along with me and a wonderful graduate student named Gretchen Patrick, is from Lewis University, is co-author of the NBC's, that's the Museum of Broadcast Communications, Great Debate Curriculum. Carol is a member of the board at the museum, and she is also executive director of the Lake Bluff Lake Forest History Center. So let's go at it. Give me a sense of what you thought happened tonight. It certainly wasn't as contentious as the presidential debate, but it did have its moments, didn't it? So, Deborah, what did you think about tonight?
This was a debate for people who had already had their minds made up. I don't think they convinced anyone one way or the other to vote for anybody who. Well, let me just say, I don't believe in undecided voters. I think that anybody who's voting knows who they're going to vote for, and so this either engendered more confidence in your candidate of choice or not. And I think probably depending on who you are choosing, you feel great about your candidate.
I think that's a really, really good point. Carol, what about you? What's your overall impression?
So I think that I agree with Deb. I don't think that there are any undecided voters out there who are like, this is the thing that's going to help me really decide. I think that we also have some interesting variations in terms of the questions people did not answer. So, the beginning question, which was a really interesting question around what would you do if your president becomes incapacitated? And neither of them answered it. You got both candidates in their 70s, and you've got two people who are, statistically relatively likely to have to take over at some point if things sort of run their normal course, and yet neither of them were even able to say, yes, we've had this conversation of what that transition is.
So I want to be clear and acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is the same disruption we had earlier. The debate is beginning to take over right now. And it's I don't know if you can hear me. Can you give me 1 second? Dennis? Nobody? Anybody hear me? Okay. So, Chris, Send me a text. Would you, Fritz?
What happens if we mute ourselves?
So let's do this. Here we go. Can you hear me now?
You sound great.
Okay, let's move ahead. Let's move ahead. So, Dennis, give me a sense of what you thought of tonight's debate and how it all shook out for you. Do you think this will just make anybody decide one way or the other?
You're on
Okay,
mute.
you're on mute. Fritz, can you unmute Dennis?
I can now. This gives us a great opportunity to think about how a debate actually works. And I'm thinking about the students and who might not have seen a debate in the past. And this actually followed a format that people could follow. And so I think that was very helpful. In terms of changing anybody's mind, I don't think that this debate was set up to do that, but to clarify the positions of the the vice president and Senator Harris.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Excuse me, I just had to step away for a minute. Um, uh, what I'm wondering though is as we go into this, uh, what is it we're going to? The whole purpose of us meeting tonight and talking about this after the is to talk about what we can talk about, what we can talk to students about. And I think what was really interesting is the obfuscation of the questions. There was a little from both sides, but people were trying to ask, what is it that we could, how can we help students understand, who was telling the truth, who wasn't telling the truth, what was happening. Um, uh, um, what do you think? What can we do? What is Carol? What do you think? What's one of the things we might be able to do for students and teachers?
So the nice thing about the fact that it was structured well, and I thought the moderators' questions were great, really on target and very very specific to each of the candidates. I think one of the things that we can ask students to do is look at what was the question, what were the answers, go to the websites for both of the campaigns, look at what the campaigns write about each of those topics, and then do sort of a validation check that says this is actually the truth, where I can find facts, this is where the facts are. There were a lot of things that they laid out that were really interesting in terms of a topic area. So one example is discussing the treatment between H1N1, the swine flu, and the treatment today. What are the statistics? How was it managed? How did people judge, from the medical community? How did they judge those things? Because those are all really interesting historical validations to look at. How was it handled and what did change? And then if you want, you can actually take them back even farther and start to look at other medical issues. You can go all the way back to polio and Roosevelt. You can go back to, as we talked about with the first debate, you can go all the way back to the Spanish flu in 1918, 19, and 20, and look at how that was handled. But I think there were some really interesting historical contexts. Kamala Harris brought up a couple points where she's like, great, let's look at the Abraham Lincoln treatment of nominating and electing a judge to the Supreme Court during an election year. Those are the sort of things. Go ahead.
I just said that was a fascinating point that you brought up. It was really interesting. And those are the things you were going to say.
And those are the things where, again, it's helping students actually frame it in historical context, because none of these discussions are new. The discussions around whether or not we should give medical coverage to people. We can go back to Roosevelt and we can look at the launch of Medicare. What were the debates that were taking place then? What were the accusations of socialism or poor, governments not being able to manage healthcare well? There are a lot of threads that have deep historical narratives that I think that we can have students pull forward.
So we had the topics that were covered tonight. We had COVID-19. We had the role of the vice president. We had the economy. We had climate change. We did China. We started with China. She moved to foreign policy and leadership. We talked about the Supreme Court. Underneath the Supreme Court, there was the issue of abortion. There was also the issue of healthcare and pre-existing conditions. Then we moved into the election. We moved into race. And so I think that it was. Are there other topics, maybe Deborah or Dennis, that you would think of we can dive into with that historical context as well? Again, it's not as though we are kind of going to talk about really rancorousness, although it was a little edgy.
Mhm.
I think it's a great opportunity for students to dive into a particular issue per Carol's comments. This reminds me of a disagreement I had with Kimmery Bowens in first grade, where she thought there was a Santa Claus, and I regrettably informed her that no such person existed. And instead of our library teacher excoriating us for arguing, she sat us down and she says, "Well, let's look into it." And she pulled out a bunch of books, and we read about together. The entire class read about the folklore of this fictional character, and we never did this come up with a final dispensation on whether or not he existed or not. We didn't change each other's minds, but we became lifelong friends. And so I can imagine a sort of like four corners scenario where we give students an issue and then we have them go into four corners, depending on where they land on the issue that the candidates discussed tonight. And then we force them to validate the opposite corner that they stand in and engage in that way.
I think that's a great suggestion. I think that's really one. And Dennis, do you have would you jump off onto any other suggestions where you could see an exercise that would work with
Well,
students?
I think ultimately this whole idea of media literacy that we talked about last time, and the final question from the moderator was about all I hear is people yelling at each other and being uncivil, and what we're looking for is civic engagement. And so, what I think when we go through questions surrounding the economy or climate change and looking back, especially at the timeline that's provided on greatdebates.org, I think it's really important to contextualize some of these conversations. And so, I think uh, that key point is that we want to have the students and everybody civically engaged.
Yeah, and I love the example that I love the example Deborah used. It's just wonderful. It's just perfect. The whole idea of great debates is if you take students out of the rancor of the moment and you look at the context historically, or if you look at something relevant to them, which of course at a certain age Santa is phenomenally relevant. It still is relevant to me. So how do you really do this? And by the way, I'm going to interrupt right now because we actually do have an audience and we have a question from somebody. What impact, if any, do you think having the candidates seated had on the debate, which is interesting? Historically, has seated versus non-seated influences the tenor of the debate? I am. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know of any studies of that. Um, uh, uh, do any of you know if anybody has looked at that?
That flows into another thought I have about what happened tonight, which is the veneer of respectability or respectability politics. And clearly, I have my own politics, and I'm going to go with one person versus another person. But I think there was a performance of respectability tonight, and I think the fact that they were seated played into this whole performance. That this was a respectable engagement when this was really a dogfight with guns and knives and rocks and every other ugly thing that you can bring to it.
Do you think that they achieved I think they were going for civility. That's exactly the way Susan Page, who is, by the way, the Washington bureau chief for USA Today, and she is a veteran in terms of she's covered 6 administrations and 11 national campaigns. So, and she basically said, she tried to lay down a tough ground rule. But do you think that? I love that you described it as a dogfight. It was a very polite dogfight. It was.
I
It
don't want
was. It
to
was.
say too much of the score, but I just do want to say one thing is that when kids are in school, there's a big premium put on being nice, and being respectable. And I think having kids navigate what that really means, interrogating what it really means to be disruptive when you should be disruptive, and calm and cool when it's the thing to do so that you can have a robust learning environment. Sometimes I think that public school specifically puts too high a premium on social control and being respectable to the detriment of actually speaking up about uncomfortable issues. And kids need to be navigated through that process.
Yeah, I think
So
that's a great.
along those lines, Yeah. Along those lines, that was one of the things I found really interesting about Kamala Harris's reinforcement of the please, I'm speaking. And watching her do that, and I know that this is something that she honed in the Senate as well, but watching her do that and thinking there's something really dramatic about watching a woman protect her verbal space so that she isn't going to get overrun. And, for those of us of a certain age in the business environment, that's something we've all had to navigate. And it's interesting to sort of reinforce for students that ability to sort of protect your voice, which leads off of what Deb was talking about, which is sometimes niceness ends up squashing your ability to speak or your ability to actually be heard. And so, how do you navigate being professional and yet still establishing appropriate boundaries around the ability to finish your thought and to continue your answer?
So, do you think the interaction? So that was between Kamala and Pence, but the action between Susan Page and Vice President Pence, several times he just kept talking, and she, and she did it with both, but much more with Vice President Pence, where he wouldn't stop, he wouldn't listen to her. It was as though, so to me, juxtaposing the two, where Kamala was basically saying, "I'm talking here. It's my time to talk." And then his ignoring the voice of Susan Page that's
Yeah.
an interesting position to really say how would that be, how could that one, because we did talk about this last time, how could the moderator have handled things better? Dennis, do you think that there was any way that she could have navigated through that a little bit better, and what students could take from that?
I think Susan Page did a really strong job of at least talking over the person that's going over time. And I agree with you that the vice president was, especially early on, uh, in many ways egregious in his speaking over the others. I was going to go to the other point, which is that idea of when you go into a debate or one of these situations, are your expectations met, and can you make predictions, can you make estimates of what's going on? And I think if we look at the president and vice president looking at running to run on the economy, and we saw them trying to turn the conversation around to the economy, and I think it was really interesting that Senator Harris wanted to bring the conversation back to COVID-19 and running on this particular moment that we're in. And so I felt as though my expectations were largely met when I was looking for something in the debates.
Mhm.
And I think that's
So
something that students can really think about in terms of kind of making that predictive moment and seeing if you're right when you're processing the information.
Interesting.
I think
I disagree with you, Dennis. That's a great point. I disagree that she did a great job, though. But I don't want to excoriate Susan. I want to excoriate the structure. I don't think she did a great job of moderating, and she should have cut Mike Pence off many, many times. She kept calling him Mr. Vice President. She could have said, "Mike, it's time to be quiet now." She obviously doesn't have cousins who came to your house and spent too much time on summer vacation. So she of cutting, cutting people off. But the questions were exquisite, but the structure that the commission has set up is a trash setup because it presumes that anything about what's going on right now is normal. And this situation that we're in is not normal. Never in the history of the country have we shut down the world or shut down the entire country or shut down the economy. Things are not normal.
and we brought this up last time. The numbers are even bigger. We're actually in the middle of the election. We are in the middle of the 4 million people have voted. That is, to me, that's just mind blowing. And so we are in the middle of election. And what is it that we can maybe craft for some of our students to really talk about the early voting and the what this does, how this affects everything. I mean, for those 4 million people who voted, if some big thing had happened tonight that would have changed their mind, they already voted. Do you think there's anything we can do with the early voting, Ms. Carroll? I love putting you on the spot.
It's an interesting point, because one of the things that you want students thinking about, because again, Dennis touched on this, is, are they delivering on the answer to the question, and are they going back to, what Chris Wallace refers to as dueling press conferences, where all they're doing is just spewing their standard thing? It'd be really interesting to have kids actually map, this was the question, this is the initial answer, and then this was the opposing team's response. Because one of the things, if you're actually learning how to debate, is what you learn to do is, for point A, did they have a counterpoint? Or did they do, this is my point, statistic A, and they say, oh yeah, but what about completely irrelevant topic? And so what you want to do is help students actually start to look at it, because what they may have thought was a winning structure isn't, when you actually start to think about, did somebody actually refute something that I said? In terms of how that affects early voting, one of the things that you can have students think about is, what are the kinds of things that should inform you as a participant in the election? These are kids who are rising into the ability to vote. What should they be paying attention to, and when do they want to vote? Do they think that debates actually will influence the way they think about it, or do they think that there's enough information when they go back and they look at the candidates' websites and at their platforms and at their public statements in advance and their previous record? Are those enough of a driver? Because, as we've discussed, we think that most voters have already gotten their mind made up, and short of somebody just coming out and dropping some kind of, horrible statement accidentally in one of these debates, nobody's going to go, yeah, I'm changing my mind.
So I love the idea of being able to get them to really dig into different issues. But I want to ask a little bit about some of the tools that are out there. So we've a number of news outlets who were tracking, fact checking as things went along. We also had NBC Tracker put together a whole bunch of numbers throughout the whole thing. NBC was saying that there were 84 attacks that Kamala Harris made. Mike Pence did 93 attacks. Kamala interrupted 9 times. Pence interrupted 16 times. And then each question, I'll show you this very colorful printout I made. Each question actually has the minutes with which with which it took to, on foreign policy, Kamala spent 4 minutes and 7 seconds. Pence spent 3 minutes and 3 seconds. Numerically quantifying this stuff. Very often when we want to move away from emotion, we go to numerical quantification. Does that have any value for the students? Or is it just an interesting way to look at this and create graphics?
I think that's an awesome way to look at it, because then it can take some of the subjectiveness out of the analysis. I have another awesome site that students should go to. It's called the Opportunity Atlas, opportunityatlas.org, and it tracks outcomes of people at the block level or zip code level, um, like 30 years after they have graduated from high school. And you can slice it, dice it by gender and race and ethnicity to see what happens, and compare one neighborhood or one city to another city or another neighborhood. So, to the point where Vice President Pence said that there is no such thing as structural racism, you could go to the Opportunity Atlas and look it up yourself.
Is I have to say that where we are, having a nonpartisan discussion, we're a 501c3, that answer in that question is just one of the ones that I can't help but shake my head at. I don't know how you can look at what has gone on in the United States and just blindly say that there is no structural racism. Especially to have a leader of our country say that, it chills you to the bone. There is a number of things, of course, chilled me to the bone of things. Go ahead, Dennis.
What I was going to say, and this is the interesting thing with statistics, and I know that Dennis can weigh in on this. So, and again, complete aside, the reason that baseball is structured the way baseball is because statistics was a growing form of math in the United States when they started developing the sports, and they decided that the best way you could actually identify which were the best athletes was statistics. That if you were able to collect a range of statistics, you would be able to put together the best team, you understand the best players, you would understand the best performances. And that over the course of the last 100 years, remains sort of the American mythology of statistics. But what I find fascinating about it is we will pick apart something like a debate so that you can get those statistics in a heartbeat. But for something that's actually quite large and quantifiable, like, structural racism, we ignore the statistical components of that. We start using anecdotes, or what we refer to in marketing as me search. This is my personal experience, therefore it must be universal. And that there's a lot of sort of subterfuge that defies what are clearly analytical statistics that tell you these sorts of things. And I just find it an interesting divide in the way the American brain works, that we're willing to look at statistics for small things, but when it comes to something where you can really identify that, in fact, more land is burning and that the hurricanes actually have higher force and they're doing more damage, there might not be more of them, but they are more powerful, that we go, well, we're not quite sure if that's really true.
Yeah, and we had another study that came out just recently about the cost of institutional racism, and the cost of that it has a serious price, not just in people, but it has a dollar price on it. And the Metropolitan Planning Council came out several years ago with another study about the cost of racism in Chicago. So we do have numbers on this. And Dennis, I'm sorry that I might have interrupted you. Were you going to go into the statistic idea as well? No.
Well, I think it goes back to that main idea of media literacy, and I think we're in this moment, and I like this edge of disruption, and I think the difficult thing for students is to find the right sources, or sources that make sense to them, but also we have so much information in real time, and so I think uh, outlets such as the work that the Museum of Broadcast Communication is doing with the greatdebates.org, and other organizations in putting forth nonpartisan information is really important, and something that students really need to keep their eye on.
So can I ask you, when we had a little bit of break between the end of the debate and I walked past a TV in the house, and there was a whole debate on the fly in Vice President Pence's hair, caught in the hair or something like that. And I want to know, and they were laughing hysterically out of that whole debate. The fact that, because that was right after the debate, out of the whole debate, the fact that they landed on that moment. What does that tell students?
That is the vice president's only black friend. Ha ha.
Oh, you were waiting for that joke.
That was very good, and I totally set you up for that. But
Well, it goes back to, again, looking at the first debate, which is if you watched it on TV or you heard it on the radio, right? Or in my case, where I watched on my phone, I didn't see the fly because, Mike Pence's head is this big on my phone. And so it's an interesting component of what you notice based on the media you are using to experience the debate.
it's it, it, it it's fascinating to look at the idea of the things that you can control and the things that you can't control, and also that inability to always be aware of your surroundings. I know the two lessons when I started every journalism class one at Medill is there's only two rules in journalism: one, everything matters, and two, ignore nothing. So there, that was that those are Michelle's rules, aren't they? I stole them from Michelle. Deborah, do you remember them? Everything matters, and I'm putting it wrong, but everything matters. And that moment in the debate, what?
And if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out.
Yeah, but I will tell you that line, I was asked to investigate that line, and this is really interesting. The real line, instead of if your mother says she loves you, check it out, has actually been cleaned up in a public relations way. When you go back, and I interviewed the people there's actually two men in their obits who are attributed with that line. Two men. Only one of them said it. And so the line that was really believed to be said was, if your mother says she loves you, kick her roundly in the shins and make her prove it. So what is fascinating about me it's fascinating about me. Well, let me tell you what's about me. What is fascinating about that to me is that the line that we use to basically say you must check everything out is actually one that doesn't check out. And it's
Right.
been
It's
cleaned up.
mythologized.
Yeah. So that's
Yeah,
a
it's
wonderful,
mythologized.
pardon me?
It's mythologized.
Yes, totally, 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 totally. I think we have one more question here. Let me take a look here. What about looking for evidence of the candidate's biases? Pence stated the Trump Supreme Court nominee is qualified because she has kids. Would they have ever said that about a male nominee to the Supreme Court?
And not only did he say she had kids, he said she had a lot of kids.
Right, right,
Right. And it's interesting because I looked at that and I was like, all right, so who in the audience is that targeting? Why is that the way he phrased that? That to
right.
me was really a fascinating moment in the debate to think about what was the selling point to that statement.
Yeah. So I remember the second rule, it's assume nothing and everything matters. And so under that rule umbrella of assume nothing and everything matters, you got to believe that he delivered that line, as you said, because it was intentional. So again,
Yeah.
looking at some of those intentional things, Dennis, can students maybe target who that remark was geared towards and whether or not that is a constituency that's needed or that's already been gained?
Yeah, I think especially surrounding the Supreme Court question, I think the two issues that keep on coming up are the abortion issue and healthcare, and I think definitely that falls into the category of the abortion issue, which is linked to religious affiliation. So I think students looking for that would be aware of where the different positions are on core issues like that surrounding the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's really.
Yep.
uh,
I was going to hook onto that because the other thing that would be really interesting to have students explore is to start looking historically at how religion was used, both in the case of the Supreme Court, but also in the case of candidates, to look at how Kennedy was talked about because he was Catholic. There was a lot of discussion in 1959 when he was starting to run about whether or not he would be more beholden to the Pope than he would be to the Constitution, right? That there is this belief that religion isn't off limits if they think that it changes the way you will manage something. And for students to be able to explore that, both in terms of the judicial space, but also the executive branch, how has it been interpreted and how has that changed over time? And what is off limits? What should be off limits in their opinion? What should be on limits? How does that influence how you will work? And is that a valid thing to evaluate in somebody that's a candidate?
Oh, and to
so-
the point of messaging, there was there were quite a few dog whistle words used throughout the debate. We heard a lot
Mhm.
about prayer first started. At some point, when I think maybe there was a perception of points lost, the word radical cropped up, and it happened
Mhm.
on the not just on the Penn side, but it happened on the other side too. And so perhaps students can dissect, um, reading between the lines and dissect messaging and maybe compare it to like another point in history. What was the message of a particular time? What does "let them eat cake" mean? Who was that meant for? Since very few people had cake.
I love that. I also think it would be interesting at one point to look at this um, debate without sound. And because there was a lot of looks back and forth, and to be able to teach students that more than 60% of how we communicate is nonverbal. So this, how Kamala was looking, how he was looking at her when she said when she gave him the mamala look and said basically I'm talking here, and it would be very interesting to say what are they saying now, even though you can't hear the words. So that's one of the thoughts that I had. We are coming up on, believe it or not, full program. And so I wanted to make sure that all of you, if you had any other parting words, again, to this is going out to our lifelong learners as well as to educators, teachers, and parents. And maybe Dennis, do you have anything that you might want to say about moving on as we take these two debates and move into the next?
Well, I think it's really important to use the materials that we have. I think we haven't talked enough about the timeline that's on the greatdebates.org, and I think it's important to think about Kennedy, but also going back to Al Smith and other figures going back even further related to that. And I think Deborah's point is really strong about trying to figure out how people try to position their opponents. We saw that tonight. Um, uh, uh, I think the vice president used a couple of times uh, 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 Biden is a supporter of communist China. So painting the Democratic Party as very far left, and I think, and the same thing was going in some ways the other way as looking at free market supporters of capitalism and supporting of the wealthy. Um, so I think students can be really helped by the timeline and then also looking for those kind of key topics going forward.
Got it. Got it. Got it. And what about you, Ms. Deborah?
I would just,
Any
I'm really, yeah, sorry. There's a raging debate on Twitter right now about the fact that Susan, a white woman, and gave Mike Pence, a white man, so much extra time to speak, and they did not give the woman of color as much time to speak. So they can go back and research and count it up and see, see what the truth really was. But I think that there's something worth interrogating, and that is who gets a chance to speak in the public conversation, not just in a vice presidential debate, but in everyday conversations, in politics, in policy discussions, in your school, on your block. And what happens when more diverse voices are allowed in that space? What can change?
That's great. That is really great. And Miss Carol?
So one of the things we didn't talk about that I actually think would be really interesting for students to explore is, do vice presidential debates matter at all? They're not going to be the president. And yet, when you look at the debate with Sarah Palin, Dan Quayle, like there are a bunch in which the performance of the vice president reflected on the decision-making policies of the man running for office, or the woman in one instance, and looking at how that shapes the expectations for how they would perform as a leader. And it's interesting to have students go back and actually start to assemble what were key moments in vice presidential debates, and were they all based on stumbles, or were there aspects in which a strong performance changed the dynamic of the way the presidential race was going to go?
I hope that we've given you enough ideas as you walk into the classroom or as you walk into the other room where your children are, or for those of you who are just interested in politics and looking at it in a different way. I can't thank you enough, Dennis, Deborah, Carol, for your time tonight. We've taken a lot more time than we planned on, and we really appreciate it. And I thank all of you for joining us. And we hope for you to go to greatdebates.org to maybe look and explore. And please feel free to send us comments about that at sschultz@museum.tv. Again, my name is Susie Schultz. I'm the Executive Director of the Museum of Broadcast Communication. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a good sleep.